how Dr. Ambedkar entered in the Constituent Assembly and his subsequent contribution to the making of Indian Constitution. So the talk will focus on the historical part of how Dr. Ambedkar ended up in the Constituent Assembly and how he became indispensable to the formulation of the Indian Constitution. This is a very interesting period which begins with the beginning of the World War II, which began in 1939, and it very dramatically changed the entire politics all over the world, including the politics of South Asia. At that time, the Indian subcontinent was governed by the British Parliament through its very special appointed officer, Secretary of State, and India was headed by the Governor General. So in 1939, when the World War II began, and during the World War II, the British wanted to seek the help of Indian people in their war against the Axis power. And the government headed by Churchill was very keen on having India support their war efforts. And though he was having a very ruthless attitude towards India, he suddenly became very conciliatory. He made a very important statement in House of Commons on 11th March 1942 that war cabinet had decided to promote a political settlement in India. So that's in 1942, in the middle of the war, on World War II. It was decided that the British government will promote a political settlement in India. After that, Cripps mission was constituted, and the mission was one-man mission which was headed by Stafford Cripps, who was a member of the War Cabinet, the special cabinet that Churchill constituted. Sir Stafford Cripps was a member of the War Cabinet. And that particular Cripps offer had the proposal for the Constituent Assembly. It was not very clearly worded, but it had the proposal of the Constituent Assembly, and subsequently we know that the Cripps proposal failed to reach the logical goal. And then soon after the World War II, Churchill got defeated in the elections in England, and in his lieu, Clement Attlee of Labour Party came into power, and he was a very great friend of India. He was also very sympathetic towards the lower caste or the depressed classes in India. And he made an appeal to Indian people from the House of Commons in London, wherein he said that he wanted Indians to join together in a united effort and work out a constitution which the majority and minority communities accept as just and fair, and in which both the princely states and provinces could take their place. Now this statement of Attlee, the Prime Minister of England, is very important because it is very clearly worded, and it talks about the Constituent Assembly or the Constitution of the Constitution Assembly very clearly, and according to this announcement, Cabinet Mission was constituted, and it came to India on 19 February 1946. It came to India in the month of February 1946, and it constituted three members. Lord Pethick Lawrence, who was the Secretary of State for India, Sir Stafford Cripps, who was the member of the War Cabinet, and about whom we have already spoken when we talked about the Cripps mission, and A.V. Alexander. He was the first Lord of Admiralty. And it seems from the communication that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had with A.V. Alexander that Dr. Ambedkar knew him very well from the beginning. Dr. Ambedkar also knew Clement Attlee very well because he had lobbied with him, he talked to him about the problems of the India's untouchables. In the month of February, the cabinet mission was constituted. It arrived in India. It was constituted earlier, but it came to India, and in the month of March, that cabinet mission arrived in India on 24th March 1946. And then it held several discussions with Indian people. So on 19 February 1946, the cabinet mission was appointed. On 24th March 1946, the cabinet mission came to India and started dialoguing and negotiating with the Indian representatives for their opinions. And on 16th May 1946, it announced that the Constituent Assembly will be set up on 9th December 1946. The cabinet mission plan, the cabinet mission members, they talked to the Indian leaders and they declared that the Constituent Assembly will be set up on 9th December 1946. So that was the deadline of the Constituent Assembly. And how they were going to select the members of the Constituent Assembly was through an indirect electorate constituting of the people who got elected in the provincial assembly elections, because there were 11 British provinces in India, and out of those 11 provinces, Congress has the power in the 7 provinces and Muslim League has the power in rest of the provinces. That's 5. Actually, that was a condition in 1937, but in 1946, out of 11 provinces, Congress had 9 provinces and Muslim League had 4 provinces. Now we are talking about the Indian subcontinent, which included Pakistan, Bangladesh and India of the present day. And if we understand the history of this period very thoroughly, we can understand the future ramifications of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now here we are talking about united India with 11 British provinces and nearly 600 princely states. So it was decided so that a Constituent Assembly will be elected by the indirect electorate, which constituted the members of the 11 British provinces. And from this electoral colleges, 296 members were to be elected from the 11 British provinces and 93 members were to be represented by the princely states. Out of this nearly 600 princely states, 93 members were to be appointed or selected by or from the princely states. And the task of electing 296 members was to be finished before the deadline, which was 9th December 1946. Now this is very important. So we can say that because Muslim League was not in favor of the joint Constituent Assembly, they opposed it, and therefore all the majority of the members in the Constituent Assembly were elected members of the Indian National Congress. So 55 members were elected from the United Provinces, the present day Uttar Pradesh. From the Madras Presidency, about 49 members were elected. From Bombay Presidency, 19 members were elected. From Bihar, about 36 members were elected for the Constituent Assembly. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar couldn't enter into the Constituent Assembly because Congress was very opposed to Dr. Ambedkar's election into Constituent Assembly. Therefore, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar did not find a place among the 296 members initially sent to the Constituent Assembly. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was not elected. And all these people were indirectly elected. And then there is a very important drama that unfolded in Bengal. So East Bengal, or undivided Bengal, which we can say was the biggest provinces, entitled to send 60 members to the Constituent Assembly. Now the United Bengal included the Bangladesh, the present day Bangladesh, which was later, when India was partitioned, called the East Pakistan. And there was a very firebrand Dalit leader, a great follower of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Jogendranath Mandal, who got elected into Constituent Assembly from the United Bengal. And he was such an ardent follower of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, he was so committed to the issues of Dr. Ambedkar, of the untouchables, and to Dr. Ambedkar, that he resigned from his post, which he was elected from the East Bengal, not from the West Bengal, but from the East Bengal. And he took up a challenge. He came to see Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, he talked to him, and he took up a challenge of electing Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar from Bengal. And then this story is retold many times as to how he and a great leader, a great Bengali Dalit leader, Mukund Bihari Malik, how they worked together and how they got Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar elected from the East Bengal. And thus Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar came into the Constituent Assembly as a member in his own right. So he didn't represent any partisan interest, but he became or entered the Constituent Assembly as a member in his own right. So that's the story how Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar ended up in the Constituent Assembly. And after this Constituent Assembly was constituted, the Constituent Assembly met formally as decided by the Cabinet Mission Plan on 9th December 1946. So the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly took place on 9th December 1946. And the senior-most member of the Constituent Assembly, Sachidanand Sinha, was the pro tem chairman of the Constituent Assembly. And the Muslim League announced the boycott of the Assembly. Muslim League, they announced the boycott of the Constituent Assembly. And on 13th December 1946, J.L. Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, because there was an interim government and Nehru was the Prime Minister of India, that is before the partition, that is before the freedom of India, independence of India, because the process has already begun. He was the Prime Minister of India. He moved the resolution, aims and objects of the Constituent Assembly. So he put a paper in front of the Constituent Assembly, which is very important paper. It has about 8 points. It has about 8 points. And then the debate ensued in the Constituent Assembly. That's on the 13th December 1946. Ma Jaikar had very strong opposition to this resolution, which was put forth by the Prime Minister of India, J.L. Nehru, and he moved an amendment that further consideration of this resolution tabled by J.L. Nehru should be postponed until such time as the Muslim League chose to participate. So he said that this resolution has no meaning unless the Muslim League also participate in the process, and he on 16th December 1946 he opposed the resolution put forth by J.L. Nehru on 13th December 1946, and there was a very tense atmosphere in the Constituent Assembly, 296 members all struck. M.R. Jaikar had opposed the resolution. He said that unless Muslim League people join in, the resolution should not move forward, and there was kind of a deadlock. So on the next day, that is the turning point in the history of India, 17 December 1946. There was a very tense atmosphere in the Constituent Assembly. Rajendra Prasad was chairing the meeting, and a few people were going to talk about the resolution, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's turn was going to come according to the scheduled list of the speaker on the next day. On 18 December he was to speak, but suddenly Rajendra Prasad called Dr. Ambedkar to address the House. Now he is a non-entity in the Constituent Assembly, and he is asked to talk on the resolution which was moved by Jawaharlal Nehru and which was opposed by M.R. Jaikar. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made this historical speech without writing a draft. He spoke, he gave a maiden speech. He didn't prepare for the speech. And the speech has gone into history as the epoch-making speech, not only I would say in the annals of history, but it changed the course of India. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is just a member of the Constituent Assembly, and he is asked to speak on the resolution. And then we are going to look into this speech in depth because it has got very important elements which concern India as a nation. But some of the elements we will touch today, and then we will enter into the details of the speech in the course of our talks. He says he condemns the resolution put forth by Jawaharlal Nehru. He opposes the resolution. He says to repeat it now as the resolution is, to say the least, pure pedantry. He calls the resolution a pure pedantry. He opposes the resolution. And he says the resolution suffers from certain other lacunae. He says all of us are aware of the fact that rights are nothing unless remedies are provided, whereby people can seek to obtain redress when rights are invaded. So he says that rights without remedies are of no importance. You have a good statement, but if you don't support it by the remedies, it has no value. Says, I find a complete absence of remedies. Even the usual formula that no man's life, liberty and property shall be taken without due process of law finds no place in the resolution moved by Jawaharlal Nehru. And then he says a very important thing. He says, I know that today we are divided politically, socially and economically. We are a group of warring camps, and I may go even to the extent of confessing that I am probably one of the leaders of such a camp. But sir, with all this, I am quite convinced that given time and circumstances, nothing in the world can stop this country from becoming one. With all our castes and creeds, I have not the slightest hesitation that we shall in some form be united people. Then he says, I have no hesitation in saying that notwithstanding the agitation of the Muslim League for the partition of India, someday enough light would be drawn upon the Muslims themselves, and they too will begin to think that a united India is better even for them. And then this is a very famous, it follows very famous paragraphs that we hear in a recording that's available to us. It's a long speech, but we will look into some of the elements of this speech. He says that so far as the ultimate goal is concerned, I think none of us need have any apprehensions. None of us need to have any doubt. Our difficulties is not about the ultimate future. Our difficulty is how to make the heterogeneous mass that we have today take a decision in common and march on the way which leads us to unity. A very important speech. And then he goes on and he makes a very important proposal. He says, let us leave aside slogans. Let's leave aside words which frighten people. Let us even make a concession to the prejudices of our opponents. Bring them in. He says, bring the opponents in so that they may willingly join with us in marching on that road which, as I said, if we walk long enough, must necessarily lead us to unity. It's a very prophetic statement which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar makes here. He even says that the question is not about the legality. The question is not about the law, he says. We should leave aside all legal considerations and make some attempts whereby those who are not prepared to come will come. Let us make it possible for them to come. That's my appeal. So he says, don't close the door for the people to come in. Let us welcome them. Let us make it possible so that they join in. Then he talks about power. He says that power is one thing, wisdom is quite a different thing. And I want this house to consider this matter from the point of view, namely whether it would be wise, whether it would be statesmanlike, whether it would be prudent to do so at this stage. That is to go alone or include all the people. And then he says, a very important paragraph, he says, when deciding the destinies of nations, dignities of people, dignities of leaders, and dignities of parties ought to count for nothing. The destiny of the country ought to count for everything. And then he says that if we try to exclude Muslims from the process of joining in the making of the constitution, he says that there will be war in this country. And he says, I am appalled at the idea that anybody in this country should think of solving the political problem of this country by the method of war. And then he goes on saying, further he cites the example of America and Britain. And he says, quoting Edmund Burke, he says, a nation is not governed which is perpetually to be conquered. If you have to conquer a nation perpetually, you can't govern it. And then I'm going to read the whole paragraph, the last paragraph of this very famous speech. These are weighty words of Edmund Burke, which it would be perilous to ignore. If there is anybody who has in his mind the project of solving the Hindu-Muslim problem by force, which is another name of solving it by war, in order that the Muslims may be subjugated and made to surrender to the constitution that might be prepared without their consent, this country would be involved in perpetually conquering them. The conquest would not be once and forever. I do not wish to take more time than I have taken, and I will conclude by again referring to Burke. Burke has said somewhere that it is easy to give power. It is difficult to give wisdom. Let us prove by our conduct that if this assembly has arrogated to itself sovereign powers, it is prepared to exercise them with wisdom. This is the only way by which we can carry with us all sections of the country. There is no other way that can lead us to unity. Let us have no doubt on that point. So this very important speech which Dr. Ambedkar made in front of the Constituent Assembly on 17 December 1946 changed the whole climate of the Constituent Assembly. It is as if Dr. Ambedkar towered very high in the Constituent Assembly, as if becoming the prophet of New India. This speech had made such an impact on the Constituent Assembly that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was afterwards included in all the major committees of the Constituent Assembly. Dr. Ambedkar became a member of all the important committees under the Constituent Assembly. Till this date, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is not the chairman of the drafting committee. He came as a member of his own in the Constituent Assembly. We saw that history as to how Jogendranath Mandal made efforts for Dr. Ambedkar to come as a member of his own in the Constituent Assembly. Then there was a resolution moved by Jawaharlal Nehru, which was opposed by M.R. Jaikar, and Dr. Ambedkar was called upon to clear his stand, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar opposes the resolution, but at the same time he expands the field in a very wider way, which makes him a very important person in the Constituent Assembly, and thereafter he is invited, he is included in almost all the important committees formed by the Constituent Assembly. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar becomes a member of Advisory Committee on 24 January 1947. Then he becomes a member of the Advisory Committee for Fundamental Rights and Minorities. Then he becomes a very important member of a very high-powered committee which is headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, which is called Union Constitution Committee, which was constituted on 4th May 1947. 3 months before India's formal independence, there was a committee, very high-powered committee. And once Jawaharlal Nehru was absent, the committee unanimously elected Ambedkar as the pro tem chairman of the committee. He was so influential, he became so influential that when J.L. Nehru was not present as a chairman of the committee, which was a very high-powered committee, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was elected unanimously as the pro tem chairman of that committee. And everybody remarked how Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar participated in the work of all the committees. He was just a member in most of the committees, but he was the most dominant person in all the committees because he did his homework very well. So when this was happening, Lord Mountbatten on 3rd June 1947 declared the partition of India. And India was partitioned. The United Bengal was partitioned into West Bengal and East Bengal. And because the partition happened, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar lost his seat from the Constituent Assembly because he was elected from East Bengal and therefore he lost his seat. So when India was partitioned, it is remarkable to note that Jogendranath Mandal was made the chairman of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. And later he became the law minister of Pakistan. But later on he resigned from Pakistan ministry because Liaquat Ali Khan was wanting to convert secular Pakistan into Islamic Pakistan. And the resignation letter that Jogendranath Mandal wrote in 1950 is a very important historical document which shows how Pakistan was going to be destroyed by its own communal violence. So Dr. Ambedkar, who was elected from East Bengal, he ceased to be a member of the Constituent Assembly. He ceased to become a member of the Constituent Assembly when India was partitioned. And he worked so hard that his presence was indispensable to the Constituent Assembly, and therefore one can see the urgency of even Congress, which Dr. Ambedkar opposed tooth and nail throughout his life. Rajendra Prasad wrote a letter on 30th June 1947 to B.G. Kher, the premier of Bombay Presidency. He wrote, "Apart from any consideration, we have found Dr. Ambedkar's work both in the Constituent Assembly and the various committees to which he was appointed to be of such an order as to require that we should not be deprived of his services. As you know, he was elected from Bengal, and after the division of the province, he has ceased to be a member of the Constituent Assembly. I am anxious that he should attend the next session of the Constituent Assembly commencing from 14 July, and it is therefore necessary that he should be elected immediately." So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar became the need. So from a very marginalized position, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar became a very central person through his hard work, determination, clarity and knowledge, and a very important speech that he made on 17 December 1946. Also, Vallabhbhai Patel wrote a letter to B.G. Kher. He also said that he wrote in a very diplomatic language, which I am going to read before you. Note the diplomatic words. Confirming my conversation with you last night, you have to make arrangement for Dr. Ambedkar's elections, if possible before the 14th. If the date of nomination is 4th, then the only way to finish the work before the 14th is to persuade other candidates to withdraw. Anyway, you do your best. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was immediately re-inducted as a member of the Constituent Assembly from Bombay. So he became now a representative of Bombay. And then India got independence on 15th August 1947. And the Constituent Assembly again met on 29th August 1947. There was a meeting of the Constituent Assembly. Now that is the Constituent Assembly of Free India, but which is carrying on from the past. Some people say that during this period, Nehru met Gandhi and he talked about making somebody else a responsible person to adopt the Indian Constitution, and his name was Ivor Jennings. But apparently Gandhi said that because Gandhi heard about Dr. Ambedkar's work in the Constituent Assembly, he heard about what he has done in the Constituent Assembly, he became indispensable to the Constitution of India. And therefore, it is said in a few records that Gandhi suggested and approved name of Dr. Ambedkar. That is a reference which is found in a book called The Makers of Indian Constitution, Myth and Reality. But as we have seen earlier, that the process of having Dr. Ambedkar, he has already been the member of the important committees. He has already been contributing to all the committees. So whether this story is true or false, it doesn't have any bearing on Gandhi's recommendation, because he was already a towering figure in the Constituent Assembly. As I said, that his speech of 17 December 1946 made him a very tall personality, a very tall man in the Constituent Assembly. And we have seen the elements of that speech, and we are going to look into the speech at length in the coming course of our talks. So when the Constituent Assembly met on 29th August 1947, on the next day, this is very important, on the next day, on 30th August 1947, the drafting committee formally met and unanimously elected Ambedkar as the chairman of the drafting committee. So the drafting committee elected Dr. Ambedkar as the member of the drafting committee, as the chairman of the drafting committee. And then drafting committee met next 44 days. It had continuous meetings. The drafting committee met 44 days, and then Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee. And for 2 continuous years, the work went on, and on 30th February 1948, a draft was completed. Now that draft was worked out in the various committees, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was already, even becoming the chairman of the drafting committee, was a member of various committees. And when he became a chairman of the drafting committee, he worked very hard. He worked so hard. How hard he worked, we are going to see that. But a draft constitution was prepared by 30th February 1948, and it was submitted to Rajendra Prasad on 21st February 1948. It was submitted to Rajendra Prasad. And on 4th November 1948, now the draft was submitted to Rajendra Prasad in the month of February, and during that period of between February and November, the draft was open to the public to scrutinize and to make comments. So it was an open document. Anybody who wanted to suggest any changes in that could make those suggestions, and that was available to all Indians throughout the length and breadth of the country. So on 4th November 1948, the draft constitution, after incorporating some of the views of the general public, including the ones expressed by eminent jurists, was formally placed before the Constituent Assembly. Before the draft document was thrown open for general discussion in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar gave a very important speech explaining the draft constitution. And that speech is a must for all the students of political science and law, because it is the concise and brief and clear exposition of the Indian Constitution. And we are also going to look at this speech in depth in the course of our coming talks. So we are going to look at the speech of 17 December 1946. We are going to look in depth at the speech which Dr. Ambedkar made on 4th November 1948. So in the month of November, when the draft constitution was placed for debates and discussion, which is now published as the Constitution Assembly debate, some people spoke in response to Dr. Ambedkar's efforts, and there is one reference which is very important. T.T. Krishnamachari, he was an articulate member of the Constituent Assembly. He said, Mr. President Rajendra Prasad, Sir, I am one of those in the House who have listened to Dr. Ambedkar carefully. I am aware of the amount of work and enthusiasm that he has brought to bear on the work of drafting this constitution. The House is perhaps aware that of the 7 members nominated by you, there were 7 members in the drafting committee. How many members? 7 members. Of the 7 members nominated by you, one had resigned from the House and was not replaced. One died and was not replaced. One was in America and his place was not filled up, and another person was engaged in state affairs, and there was a void to that extent. So there were 4 people who were already out of the drafting committee. 1 or 2 were far away from Delhi, so that makes 6. 4 plus 1 or 2 means 50-50, that makes 6. Perhaps reasons of health did not permit them to attend. So it happened ultimately that the burden of drafting the constitution fell on Dr. Ambedkar, and I have no doubt that we are grateful to him for having achieved this task in a manner which is undoubtedly commendable. So though there were 7 members, the 6 were gone, and only Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had to work out the draft of the constitution, which was placed before the Constituent Assembly on 9th November 1948. And after this 4th November 1948, discussions took place in the Constituent Assembly, and the article-wise debate took place in the Constituent Assembly, and Dr. Ambedkar responded to various amendments which were suggested by Constituent Assembly, and he answered some of the very key questions which are of concerns even today. And when, after the final debates and discussion, a final constitution was submitted, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made a very important third speech in the Constituent Assembly on 25th November 1949. And we are going to look into that speech also. So this is how Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar became the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and the subsequent work that he put forth in order to give this country its constitution.